Alrighty, hello students. We're going to go ahead and get started on chapter 1, Introduction to Biology. I'm going to go ahead and split the recordings into two recordings. That way it's not a super huge recording. And so we're going to go ahead and get started with chapter 1. So let's first start with one of our famous scientists, Charles Darwin, who's credited for developing the theory of evolution by means of natural selection. And until this day, it is at the core of our science of biology. This is something that we are going to look a little bit more at towards the end of the chapter and understand how he developed this theory and the contributions that allowed him and led him down this path to the development of the theory. The next thing that we look at here, and I'm going to be using my pen just a little bit, hopefully it'll go well for me, is understanding how do we define biology, right? So biology is, as it says, the study of living organisms. But I always ask a question in class, and I ask, like, how do you define biology? What does biology mean to you? And so I want you to just take a little bit of time first to think about when you hear biology and you enter this class, what did you think you were going to learn about? And what you will find is it's not a single answer. You're going to find that there's this huge, broad variety of things that all falls under biology. So whether you're looking at something from the cellular level or from the organismal level or from population level, right? Or if you're focusing on particularly the way species interact with one another, or if you're looking at the chemistry aspect of things, there's just so much that falls under biology. But we want to relate it to, again, it's the study of living organisms, and all of the things that I've described right now. It gives you understanding of the diversity of life. And there's a lot going on, right, under that particular umbrella of biology. But there are certain characteristics that living organisms share. And that's how we start to organize all of this diversity that we see in living organisms. So some of the ways that we start to organize is number one, and you do want to recognize these, is the three domains. So you want to be able to recognize what are the major three domains and then examples of each of those, right? So the three domains, you have bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Bacteria, of course, being the most broadest and the most diverse, located in all kinds of aspects of our planet, right? And archaea, that group is pretty interesting. They are located in areas that are difficult to survive in, right? So sometimes low pressure points, high pressure points, hot temperatures, right? Low temperatures. And then eukarya, that's the one that we fall into, right? So under the domain eukarya, you can also further subdivide it into kingdoms. So under domains, you have the flat classification of kingdoms, and under eukarya are the ones that you might be more common with. So fungi, plantae, and there's us, right? Animalia, and as well as the protists, right? So don't get protists, maybe bacteria confused. Those are two different groups, right? And all of this falls under eukarya. So for anything that falls under eukarya, most of them are going to be in the multicellular level, not all of them. Protists are kind of in their branch of their own, and that they are mostly unicellular, but they still have other characteristics that classify them as eukarya. As it says, protists, again, kind of unique in their own, no common ancestor, unlike those that you see in the other eukaryotic kingdoms like fungi, plantae, and animalia. So let's look at examples of those. So as you list and look at your respective kingdoms, you also want to give yourself some examples of each of those, right? So remember, under the kingdom, when you're looking under your eukaryotic kingdoms, you have your protists, right? Your fungi, your plantae, and your animalia. So again, most of your protists single cell, are unicellular living organisms. So that means they're not going to have a lot of complexity. When we look at fungi, for these, you think funguses, mushroom, right? Organisms that have the ability to, as it says, digest their food. So they are in the realm of like your decomposers. Plantae, those are all your plants. And sorry, let me take a step back. Fungi is also multicellular. Plantae, multicellular. There are terrestrial, but there's also aquatic, right? Plants as well. And their major function, of course, is the process of photosynthesis, the conversion of light energy, right, over into a form of chemical energy. And then here's us, right? We fall in the realm of animalia. We are non-photosynthetic. That means we cannot absorb the sun, right, and produce energy. We are also multicellular organisms, but we are dependent on consuming something externally. So we have to, or internally, we have to digest our food in order for us to convert that energy, right, and obtain the energy. And then at the top, this just goes back to the other two major domains. So remember, you have the domain eukarya, archaea, and bacteria. So domain archaea, an example that's being given to you here is methogen, right? The ability to produce methane as a result of its normal metabolic activity. So again, that group, the archaea, is the rare group. They can live in very toxic environments that would probably kill a normal animal cell, but these guys thrive, right? Domain bacteria, again, most diverse of all the groups. They're teeming on every single surface that you can imagine. They can also have the ability to live in multiple different types of environments, and as well as what they have the ability to break down and undergo their metabolic reactions. So this is showing you, for example, sulfur bacteria, right? To be able to undergo light energy, right? And break that particular compound down. So pretty unique. So how do we begin to classify what is living? So we looked a little bit at the classification systems there, but how do we begin to define what is the difference between a living organism versus a non-living organism? And the example is like, what's the difference between us, like, and a rock, right? So when we look at the differences here, there are some key concepts that we can capture living organisms under, and you want to have an understanding of those. And we're going to list those in just a little bit. And these living characteristics are something that have been passed down from the beginning of life, right? From the beginning of the organisms as they evolved and as they've passed on from generation to generation and generation. So this is what we consider, or how we classify what we consider living versus non-living. So the first thing, and as you build your notes, you're going to want to put at the top, you should put fundamental properties of life, and then start to list what we consider part of those classifications, right? So the first one is going to be cellular organization, right? So this is part of the cell theory. All living organisms are composed of one or more cells, or all cells arise from pre-existing cells. So no matter what organism we look at, when we look at those domains, right, in the kingdoms and so forth, whether they're single cellular or multicellular, they're still composed of a single cell. So that is what we define as life, is at the cellular level. And the reason for that is cells have the ability to carry out what we consider the basic activities of life. They have the ability to undergo metabolic reactions. They have the ability to produce energy, right? They have the ability to divide, right? And then they can sustain themselves as well, depending on the organelles, right, that they contain, and as well as the complexity of those particular cells. So the more complex an organism, the more complex the cells are usually that compose that particular organism. The more simpler the organism, most of the time, the more simpler the cells, right, of that particular organism. So that's an example of cellular organization. right? So at the basis, living organisms we consider are going to be composed of one or more cells. The second characteristic is energy utilization. All living things require energy. So we need energy. If we look at ourselves like as humans, we require energy one way or another. We cannot go without eating, right? So that's why we have to eat breakfast, lunch, right, and dinner. And the reason for that is everything that is happening internally, all of our metabolic reactions in regards to growing, cellular division, so forth, require energy. If you want to look at it at a larger scale, the ability for you to get up and move and walk and so forth requires energy. Just the process of thinking, taking this class right now, taking notes, studying requires energy. The brain requires quite a bit of energy. And the only way we can do that, of course, for us as humans, is we have to consume something else, right? So I put a little bit of a food web in here to just kind of understand how energy is captured, right? So the first process that kicks off energy being captured, of course, is our plants, right? So plants have the ability to capture sunlight and then convert it over into chemical energy. And then everyone else basically depends on that, right? So the example given here is like the little grasshoppers consume the grass, and then the birds consume the grasshopper, and the original energy that was converted over here is being passed on from the grasshopper to the bluebird, right, to the larger complex apex predators, right? And that's the same pathway that we take when we are consuming food. A lot of times, if we can eat greens directly, right? So tomatoes and vegetables and stuff that we may consume, or maybe we eat other kinds of meats, right? Like beef, right? Or chicken. And that energy is still obtained and stored within the bonds there of those particular organisms that we're consuming because they consumed plants prior to that, right? So there's a little bit of the pathway there. So that is energy utilization. You want to have an understanding of what that means as energy moves through various organisms. So for our plants, right, algae and so forth, they have the ability to undergo photosynthesis. For all of the other animals, including us, we have to extract our energy, right, from other organisms by eating either plants, right, or animals. Number 3, homeostasis, right? Homeostasis. I like to think of homeostasis like a balance beam. That's something that, let's say it was like this. This is a homeostasis right here, and we're right at equilibrium, right? And it's teetering on this, maintaining this internal environment that is very important for us, right? And if you happen to put pressure on one side or the other, then that beam is set off. So homeostasis is like constantly trying to maintain that balance beam, relatively constant internal temperature, right? Even though the external temperature is constantly changing, right? And so the question I ask here, and I want you to think about it really quickly, is which species do you think maintains a constant internal temperature? Is it humans or is it the realm of the lizards, right? Geckos and so forth. So if you know a little bit about animals, right, you know that these little guys on the right-hand side cannot maintain their body temperature. So you usually have to have a light for them in which they can warm themselves. Those guys will shift to their environment. So they definitely don't maintain their body temperature the way we do. For us, we do, right? Humans, we sit at 98.6 degrees, right? Fahrenheit. And we have the ability to maintain that particular body temperature due to all of the body systems that we have contributing towards maintaining homeostasis. If we were to step outside right now, it's summertime, while I'm doing this recording, but it's summertime. And if you were to step outside right now, you would start to sweat. It's very hot in Texas, right? So that sweat helps contribute to that little balance beam at the top that is helping to maintain, right, the body temperature. And that's just one example of homeostasis. You can talk about respiration rate, blood glucose rate, digestion. All of those are maintaining a very narrow spectrum of internal conditions that must be maintained. And many of your mammals fall down this particular pathway of homeostasis, where other organisms have the ability to shift a little bit more towards their external environment. Let's look at number 4. So growth, development, and reproduction. Right? So when we hear this particular topic, what I want you to have an understanding of is automatically think cellular, right, division. And when we look at cellular division, we're talking about mitosis, right, and meiosis. There is a YouTube link that you can click here in the PowerPoint that will show you cells actively dividing. But what I did is I copied an image that's kind of similar to the YouTube link. And these are some epithelial cells, like cells that you would see in your cheek. And when we think about cellular division, it has multiple reasons as to why it helps sustain that living organism. So, number one, if we look at growth, that is the ability for us to grow from the size of an infant right into toddler and childhood and adolescence and then adulthood. And that is due to cellular division, cells that are actively dividing, increasing in number, and allowing the growth of that. So, growth and development kind of go hand in hand with one another. So, for multicellular organisms, they undergo a process known as mitosis. And for bacteria, that are single cellular, they don't undergo that particular type of cellular division. It's known as binary fission, and they just kind of split into two. We'll look a little bit more at cellular division more in depth in the future chapters. So that's a little bit of a view on the growth and development, but you can also look at it from the reproductive stance, right? So when we talk about reproduction, that's meiosis. So the ability of the sperm and the egg to be produced. And then that is going to allow the passing, right, of genes from parent, right, to offspring. So all of that is wrapped under the topic of cellular division. You want to make sure and write some notes on what growth, development, and reproduction represents. And that goes hand in hand with the next step, right? What we were just discussing. So heredity, right? So when we look at heredity, so right, we're talking about meiosis and so forth. Within the cell, you have the nucleus, and within the nucleus, you have DNA, right? When we look at DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, right, is the full term. These living organisms have DNA that ends up being replicated, right, living organisms, and passed on to their offspring. And this can result in particular characteristics. For example, why maybe you have brown hair that looks like mom's or brown eyes that look like dad. But it can also be height, and it can also be down the pathway of health, right? As to what is being inherited. So all organisms have a genetic system, all living organisms, and all of them are going to have DNA, right? So no matter what species you look at, in general, if we were to look at a plant, right, or if we were to look at fungi, or if we were to look at, let's say, a dog or a cat, everything has DNA. So that means the ability for that genetic information to be passed on, right, from parents, right, to the offspring. And then that is how it's passed on from generation to generation. And there's a little bit more of DNA and understanding what it does and so forth. But again, we'll devote an entire chapter to DNA and DNA replication towards the later ends of Bio 1406. All right, let's look at another way that we can start to organize living systems. So this is the hierarchy of organization. And again, as you build your notes, I would like you to understand the hierarchy of organization from simple to complex. right? So from simple to complex and vice versa. And then for each of those, I want you to have examples of what that means, right? So be able to identify the hierarchy of organization from simple to complex and vice versa, in case you get a question on the lecture exam. And then as well as be able to identify what it falls under, okay? Particularly examples of that. So the first level that we look at, which is the simplest level, is at the cellular level. Now, depending on your textbook, sometimes this is broken down a little bit differently, but for this particular text, it's kind of grouping everything together, right? So at the very basic, at the very start of the building blocks are atoms, right? So atoms will form together, right, and structure and orient together to form your molecules, right? So as you write your notes, you can write it also in a pathway similar to this to give you an understanding. Molecules will orient and arrange themselves in particular manners to form macromolecules. So those are your particular types of macromolecules that we look at that have particular functions, structure, that are very important to sustaining the overall organism. And then those macromolecules orient in particular ways, right, to help form your organelles. And then by the time we get to the organelles, these are unique little entities, right, that have the ability to perform particular functions, particular structures, and are pretty much unique each to respectively. And then finally, we get to when we're looking at the hierarchy of organization, when we finally get to the cell is what we consider, look at that term there, living. So anything prior, all what you see here from here down, this is considered non-living, right? So non-living at this point. And the reason for that is the cell has all of the mechanics, again, everything that it needs to sustain itself, to undergo reproduction, to be able to produce, right, anything that's necessary in regards to the organelles that may be produced. It's got DNA, everything that it needs to survive on its own. So for example, if I were to take a cell, put it on a petri dish, give it the correct nutrients in the environment that it needs, that cell would survive, right? It'd start to divide and replicate, and it would fall under all of the 5 things that we just listed earlier as to what we consider living. So that is important for you to be able to recognize in the hierarchy of organization what is considered living, right? The basic unit of life. And then we get into, in the same way, you can build your notes and just kind of filter it down in the organismal level. So after cells, we're going to continue on in the last. So after cells is tissues, and then organs, organ systems, and then the organism. So tissues, what those are, is those are groups of similar cells working together to perform a particular function, right? And then at the organ level, oh, let me take a step back. Tissues could be, for example, like the epithelial tissue that I showed you earlier, like in your cheek cells, or muscle tissue, right? Or nervous tissue. Organs are composed of one or more tissues that are working together to perform a particular function, right? And then you get to the organ system level. And the example that's being given to you here is like the nervous system. So the organ system level is multiple different organs working together to perform a particular function that is going to contribute to the overall organism. So here in the organism or the organ system level, that's the brain, right? The spinal cord and all the nerves that are associated with it. So different organs. And then the organism, by the time you get to the level of the organism, that is all of the organ systems working together. So the nervous system, the respiratory system, the digestive system, right? Working together to perform homeostasis, to maintain that constant internal environmental temperature, for example, or other metabolic activities that are happening within that particular organism. Let's see. And then you get to the population level, right? So in the population level, and you can just kind of continue to filter it down, the population, as it says, is specific species, right, of a particular community, right? So it could actually go organismal, species, right, community, right, population. When we look at, or sorry, population, community, when we look at those particular types of populations, this just means that these are different groups of species, right, that maybe, or sorry, similar groups of species that are um, living together in a particular area, right? And this is showing you an example that you have two different types of species here. Cute little ducks, right? So here, this is showing you two completely different types of species, even though they live in a similar like type of environment. And then when you get into the community, now you have multiple different types of species, right, that are living together in a particular area. And then that leads into, and so that's all the living components. Then you get to the ecosystem level. And in the ecosystem level, it is still all of those things, right? So the species, right? Your community, your population, but now we're also including the non-living factors here as well. So the soil, the water, the air, right? All of that is part of the ecosystem. And so ecosystems have no definitive set number. Ecosystems can be basically on your pencil, right? If you had enough of a group of species there, right? In community, it could become, right, an ecosystem. So and then encompassing, covering everything is going to be at the biosphere level. So from the ozone down is considered still under the ecosystem, but that is the biosphere. So as you write your notes, again, you're just going to want to follow the pathway, right? Population, species, community, ecosystem, all the way to the biosphere, and then as well as have examples of each of those. All right, I'm just going to do a little bit more here, and then I will stop this recording and I will cycle into the next part of the chapter. So the nature of science, it says science aims to understand the natural world through observation and reasoning, right? So that means we want, and hopefully you as well, want to have an understanding of why things happen. And it just as humans, we're naturally inquisitive. Like, why does that work that way? Like, why does, why does my plant die if I don't water it? So I know why, right? It needs water. But there's a lot of questions that we have that we're inquisitive about as to, well, we want to have an understanding of like, why does it work that particular way? And so this is the natural phenomenon. In order for something to be considered scientific, though, we do have to be able to do those two things that you see there. We have to be able to observe, right? We have to also be able to undergo experimentation and then work through that particular reasoning of the experiment, of the original observation. So these are what we consider like natural forces. Um, and the fundamental nature of the universe has not changed since the beginning. So we have the ability again to study, observe, understand, and find an answer to why those things are happening. That's the beauty of science, or one of the reasons that I'm very interested in the realm of science, is because it gives you an answer, whether it's a yes or no answer to your original question, you're getting an answer at the end of the day as to why that particular natural phenomenon is occurring, right? So one of the ways that we start to, after we've made that particular observation, and start to answer particular questions that we may have, is by undergoing what is known as the scientific process, right? The scientific process. So here we have the first step, and I do want you to understand the steps of the scientific process and as well as examples of each of those steps. So the first step is making an observation, right? So something that you observed that can lead to a hypothesis. And I want you to be able to define, right? What is a hypothesis? hypothesis, right? An educated guess. And hypothesis, the next thing is, this is a very important part. The hypothesis has to be testable. If you cannot test that hypothesis, then that is more of down the realm of getting into maybe possibly like a feeling or emotions or something else, but it's not scientific. You have to be able to measure, right? Test, observe, run the experiment in order for that observation to be headed down the pathway of the scientific process, right? And then eventually the next step is, once it is, we have the experiment, we can test the experiment and run the experiment and then look at the results. And the results will tell you, was your original hypothesis true or false? You get an answer to that, right? And whether it's true or false, it's still an answer. And it gives us the ability to understand that original question that we had, right? So this overall process that we're talking about here, these steps here, are descriptive types of scientific processes. And most of science is descriptive, like the way we classify life on Earth is an example, or the way we sequence the human genome is descriptive, right? But there's also a form of logical reasoning. And there, I would like you to recognize the two types. So there's deductive and inductive reasoning. When we look at deductive reasoning, as it says, it applies to the general principles to predict specific results. Deductive reasoning is used to infer the species of a specimen from its characteristics. I found an image that I thought it was a little bit easier to kind of understand the differences between these two, because it gets a little bit confusing. So let's look at deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning works from the level of the existing theory and what we already know, right? So applying the general principles to be able to get to a result. So what do we already know? And then from what we know, let's develop a hypothesis, run the experiment, and then see if that hypothesis is proven true or false. Where inductive reasoning, it says, uses specific observations to construct the general scientific principles. And so this is more the scientific process from the last slide that we looked at. So inductive is going to go from the opposite. We're going to go from an observation first, right? And then run the scientific process, right? The steps, develop the hypothesis, run the experiment, and then get a conclusion. So they're very much flipped around, but they're each of them have their benefits as to how you work through those particular types of reasonings. So you do want to have an understanding of each of those examples of each of those, and you may get a couple examples on questions on the exam that you will need to be able to decipher between deductive and inductive reasoning. And so we look at, let's look at those steps of the scientific process, right? So we said the first thing that needs to happen is an observation, right? We have the hypothesis that is formed. You can predict what you think will happen, run the experiment, and then what is the conclusion? So on the right-hand side, this is showing you the original problem, the observations that were collected from that, and the general hypothesis. At the level of the general hypothesis, you can start to predict, if this happens, or if I do this particular experiment, this is what it's going to occur. So the example that I always use is, let's say the problem that I have is I have a flashlight and the light bulb is not turning on, right? So those are my collective observations, the problem and the observations, right? My observation could be that I believe the batteries in the flashlight, or sorry, my hypothesis, I believe the battery in the flashlight may be old, and that's why the flashlight's not turning on. So the testable prediction would be, if I replace the batteries, then the flashlight is going to turn on, right? So let's say I run the experiment and I change the batteries, and guess what? The light still didn't turn on. So that rejected the original hypothesis, and that's okay. I'm going to go back and I'm going to reevaluate my original hypothesis. Okay, it wasn't the batteries. Maybe it is the light bulb that needs to be replaced. So let's go through it right again. This really quickly. So let's go through that process again. So my original hypothesis, now I've changed the hypothesis, right? Or altered it. My hypothesis is if I change the battery, the light bulb, I already confused myself, the light bulb, that the flashlight is going to turn on, right? So those are the testable predictions. I run it, and guess what? The hypothesis is supported. And you want to be able to replicate the original experiment, right? To continue to support the hypothesis. So if it's another type of experiment, you want to be able to continue the replication and undergo new tests that will continue to support the hypothesis. This pathway here, the best way to make sense of it is, let's say there was an experiment that was conducted and this one person found the cure to cancer, and he only ran it once, right? And he could never run it again, right? So that leads down the pathway of falsification, and you still have to go back and modify the original hypothesis. You want to be able to replicate the original experiment over and over and over again, to continue to contribute to that large body of scientific evidence. And notice it's not this just strict pathway. We have to go back, we have to make changes, and that's okay. And that's the process of science. It is an indefinite, continuous process of testing and experimentation that will continue to allow us to develop our highest level of technology, science, and medicine is the process that you see here, right? Experimentation, right? So the scientific method. So again, let's just test, I talked about this briefly earlier, but let's just jump back to that really quickly. A hypothesis, when you create a explanation, right, of your observation, you have to be able to undergo an experiment, right? So you have to be able to generate testable predictions. If not, then we don't consider that a scientific hypothesis, right? Hypothesis can be supported or rejected. That's fine. You're still getting an answer to the original hypothesis, whether you get the yes or the no type of answer. And then if you get a no, that doesn't work out, right? Then similar to the light bulb, right, and the battery of the flashlight, you can go back and rewrite that particular hypothesis. And then eventually you want the hypothesis to have a nice pile of, right, additional testing and data to represent and reflect the scientific basis of that hypothesis, right? So in the experimental level, we're just going to kind of touch on these really quickly. When you are testing the hypothesis, something that you always would want to look at if you were ever to evaluate an experiment is to make sure that you see there should be two types of groups within that particular experiment. So you should have an experimental group as well as always a control group. If at any time you look at an experiment and it does not have a control group, then those are non-valid results. You have to have something to compare next to the experimental. You can't just claim that there's particular changes, like, oh, this had a really, positive effect in this experiment, but if you don't have a control group, then how do you know what you are comparing against? So those are the two things that you really want to see in an experiment one major thing, right, is that control group. And then when we look at the experimental treatment, this is the change that's going to be made, right, in comparison to the control group. Both are run almost identically within the experiment, minus, right, whatever variable of interest is going to be changed for the experimental treatment. There are two definitions that you want to understand here, the independent and the dependent variable. The independent variable, as it says, what you manipulate within the experiments, and the dependent variable is what you observe, right, or measure. You think of the dependent variable as it's dependent on the independent variable. So there's changes to the dependent variable depending on what particular experimental or variable of interest that you're looking at in the experimental group. All righty. Okay, we're going to stop right there.